I felt it was really important to share this story about July Perry and Most Norman. I apologize if I'm not directly looking at the camera sometimes. I am reading from an article. I wanted this video to be factual, and there's just so much information that it would be impossible for me to tell you solely based on my memory. As many of you know, I was born and raised in Orlando, Florida, and I came across this story that happened in the 1920s, and I really felt compelled to share it with you guys. This is referencing the Ocoee Massacre. The Ocoee Massacre was considered the single bloodiest day in modern America. It was a violent race riot that broke out on November 2nd, 1920. African American owned buildings and residences in northern Ocoee, a city in Orange County, Florida, were burned to the ground. The African Americans residing in Ocoee, who were not direct victims of the race riot, were later driven out by threats of force. A total of 330 acres, plus 48 city lots owned by 18 black families living in Ocoee, lost their land. Since then, Ocoee would remain an all-white town until 61 years later in 1981. July Perry was a well-respected godfather of the northern black community, who served as a deacon in the church and a local labor leader. It was said that anyone who was seeking to employ black leaders needed to speak with him first. Perry, who encouraged young blacks to be educated and stand up for themselves as first-class citizens, was an admired civil rights leader. Morris Norman was a well-known and prosperous man. Norman and his wife Eliza owned a 100-plus acre family orange grove. It was said that they were once offered $10,000 for his groves, a huge sum of money at that time, but he refused to take it. Orange County, as the rest of Florida, was originally politically dominated by Southern white Democrats. However, in the weeks leading up to the presidential election in 1920, African Americans throughout the South were registering to vote in record numbers. July Perry and Most Norman led the local voter registration efforts in Orange County, even paying the poll tax for those who couldn't afford it. However, the massive registration coincided with the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 20th century. Providing a tense racial and political climate before the election, the Klan sent threatening letters to them to stop voter registration or fear the consequences. On November 1st, the day before the election, with robes and crosses, the Klan paraded through the streets of the two black communities in Ocoee late into the night with megaphones. They warned that not a single African American would be permitted to vote, and if they dared to do so, they would face dire consequences. On Election Day, African Americans were met with resistance from white community when they attempted to vote. Black voters were turned away with either threats or violence, or poll workers who found their names mysteriously absent from voter registration rolls. But Most Norman would not be deterred. After being prevented from voting, Norman rode to Orlando to seek the counsel of Judge Cheney, who told him that the interference of voting at that time was illegal, and instructed him to take down the names of all African Americans that were denied their constitutional rights. Norman returned to Ocoee with these instructions, along with a handful of black citizens seeking to vote. After being forcibly turned away, he demanded the poll workers' names and exclaimed, "We will vote, by God." At the time, it's been speculated that Norman may have had a loaded shotgun in the back seat of his car. An altercation ensued. He was overpowered, beaten by the butt of his own gun, then driven away by whites. The white community began to form a mob and paraded up and down the streets, growing more disorderly and unmanageable. The rest of the African Americans gave up trying to vote and left the polling place. Later during the evening, Sam Salisbury, a white leader and a former chief of police of Orlando, is called upon to lead a lynch mob to find and punish Morris Norman. the white mob was marching to the home of Morse Norman when someone informed them that Norman was visiting the home of July Perry. The mob, which numbered about 100 men, arrived at Perry's house, demanding that Perry and Norman surrender themselves. They received no answer, and they attempted to break down the door. Perry, who had been warned about the mob in advance, fired gunshots from inside the home. In fact, the Perry family so valiantly defended their homes that some were even convinced that there was a large group inside. Sam Salisbury got shot in the arm, and 2 other of Salisbury's men were killed when they tried to storm the house by kicking in the door. Defeated, the mob retreated temporarily to get reinforcements and additional manpower from the Klan members in surrounding areas. The Perry family used the 2 to 3 hours to escape the house. Perry had been severely wounded and fled with help of his wife. Around 50 cars full of Klan members flooded into Ocoee from towns such as Winter Garden, Orlando, and Sanford. A manhunt ensued, and Perry was later found, taken to Orlando General Hospital on Cool Avenue. Perry was released into sheriff custody later that night and taken into the Orlando jail, probably near the old courthouse near Central and Magnolia. A lynch mob descended upon the jail, to which Sheriff Frank Gordon handed the keys over to Perry's cell. They wasted no time in seizing him, beating him, and they dragged him through the streets behind a car before arriving at the entrance to the Orlando County Club near Lake Concord, where Judge Cheney's home stood. The mob strung up a now near-dead Perry to a telephone pole along the highway. His hanging body was riddled with bullets. This gruesome scene was left there as a warning to both Cheney and other African Americans, with a chilling note attached to his body saying, "This is what we do to who try to vote." Sometime later, Perry was cut down by a black undertaker named Edward Stone. Against the wishes of the KKK, who threatened Stone afterwards, he was brought to the Greenwood Cemetery south of Orlando, where his body was buried in the black section of the graveyard. He remained in an unmarked grave until November 2002, when a movement led to a locating of his gravesite and adding a headstone to memorialize him. After the white mob lynched Perry, their vengeful lust spread to the rest of the African American community in Ocoee. At least 20 buildings were burned in total, including an African American church, a schoolhouse, and a lodge room in the vicinity. The siege of Ocoee claimed numerous African American lives and victims. Hearing the story about July Perry and Morse Norman, I felt moved to contact one of the members of the NAACP. The branch in Orange County, Florida was founded because of what happened in the lynching of July Perry. She was very nice and agreed to talk to me. I had more questions about the poll tax. I learned
the poll tax just wasn't in Florida.
Right.
The poll tax was against, and it was basically in the South.
Mm-hmm.
It was really a deterrent for black people to vote.
Right. And I learned that basically, I guess, Morse Norman and July Perry, when they went to vote at the polls, they were turned away because of the Klan and everything else. They were trying to prevent them from voting, even though their poll tax had been paid for them.
Well, see, the thing about it, you know, I always tell people, you know, we can write legislation to give people certain protection, either to keep them from being allowed to do certain things. But see, the one thing we can't do is legislate the hard.
Right.
And even though the laws were in place and they had done what they wanted, you still had people who were racist, who did not want and who did not feel that black people should have that ability to voice their opinion, you know.
Right.
And this is what we had, and that's where the massacre in Ocoee came about.
Yes, ma'am. Also, was the, do you know if the, obviously now, with African American voters, are there any things current day that do prevent them from voting, coming out in the polls?
Sure. One thing is, right now, is the fact that a lot of African Americans don't feel that their votes count, because when they elect people and they get into office, they don't do anything to help them in terms of their issues.
Yes.
Our education system, people that we voted for, the people that support our issues are in the minority.
Right.
So until we make those changes to get them out of the minority and put them into the majority, we're going to always have these problems.
For me, anyway, the history of all of this is very important in documenting. I actually tried to look up anything that I could about July Perry, voting rights, anything like that, as far as a comprehensive video of what happened.
You're not going to find it.
And I have not found a single shred of video.
You're not going to find it, because the all of that was suppressed.
Yes.
Only time you're going to get it is people. He has family members. His family members are people who were there. You know what I mean? In other words, you get the hand-me-down stories, but in a real documentation that you can go to and get from a newspaper, it's just not there.
Yeah, and I learned that a lot of they actually didn't even report it. They wouldn't even report it. It was like a common thing, and they wouldn't even report about these murders.
It was his family who basically told what happened and how they thrust into their homes, and and all the people that lived during that time are the ones who told the story.
Right. And you would think Orange County would do some type of documentation, but nothing has really been done. I mean, there's only a handful of articles from people who wanted to know, but as far as a video, I've looked and there is really no documentation.
Well, not only a video, but even if they don't have the video, so to speak, they could do a documentary.
Right.
He had family members who were still living. I don't know if I'm sure it's a lot of offspring
right.
that are still here in Orange County, because they fled Ocoee.
Right.
But I'm just saying it's not good.
If you wouldn't mind, could you explain to me like what a sundown town was?
What a sundown city was is, if you were African American and you were caught in a city after the sun went down, you could be murdered.
So there were a lot of people, I'm assuming, that
and actually we just recently we still had a sundown city, and that was in Perry, Florida.
Still to this day.
To believe, isn't it?
Still to this day. Wow.
And I'm talking, this has been less than 10 years ago.
Wow.
But Perry, Florida was still considered a sundown city, and there was a place in Perry. If you were black and you went in there after a certain time, you did not come out.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I'm sure.
And I'm telling you, this has been within the last 10 years.
So, you guys are very, very important in helping African Americans, and I have nothing but respect for your organization. I just wanted to tell you that.
Well, don't say your organization. It should be your organization too. You should come and join us.
Right. Well, I the thing is, I had no idea that Caucasians could join the NAACP. And this is just my ignorance.
Do you know that it was founded? As a matter of fact, we had Caucasians as our founders.
I had no idea, ma'am. I'm honestly just putting this, and part of it, I apologize, is my own ignorance, but I'm just putting all of this trying to put it together as best as I can, and I'm learning as I go along.
But you know something, it says a lot for you, and I'm not saying this because you're on the phone.
I just can't believe people could do this to somebody. To somebody who was just trying to vote. About something, it's another when it's right in front of your face. My reasoning behind putting the oranges on his grave was I learned that he was a successful citrus farmer, and he also grew sugarcane.